Chapter 23. Cracker had just arrived at where she had been with Rick, had lived with Rick, and it was empty. I'm assuming it was the place where they had built, they had the dog kennels, and 20 and Cody and all them had stayed. So let's figure out if that's what she's talking about. That is, it was empty. There were people who weren't Rick's friend. It wasn't empty. There were people who weren't Rick's friends going through the garbage, gathering pieces of wood or metal into baskets, and generally swarming over the camp, taking everything they could. She saw men yanking at wood stakes stuck into the ground. She saw children dragging huge cans. She recognized some of the people from before when she and Rick used to watch the locals pick through the trash. But Rick and his friends were gone. Someone spotted her and started talking in an excited voice, but nobody moved. Instead of running off, which was her first instinct, she charged toward Rick's home had been. People scattered as she snarled at everyone who didn't move out of her way. When she reached Rick's former home, she stood still a second to smell. She found where his bed had been. She could smell him. She whined, but turned around just as several men were trying to creep toward her with big wooden sticks in their hands. She decided it was time to go. So this was where they had built the barracks and the dog kennels. They have already cleared everything out. Remember, they were talking about when he was talking to Cody about doing a second tour of duty, and Cody told him they had started something called Vietnamization. This is where, remember I told you the American people were at odds over being involved in the Vietnam War, because the only reason we were there was to stop communism, because we wanted people to be able to have a democracy, wanted them to be able to choose who ruled over them. Americans didn't like socialism and communism, nothing. We didn't like government controls over everything. We wanted choice for the people. So there was a division over whether or not we needed to be there and be involved in incurring debt means raising debt and losing the lives of our soldiers. So the Vietnamization was where the soldiers were trying to train the South Vietnamese people to take over and fight for themselves, somewhat like what we're doing in the Middle East, or what we had tried to do in the Middle East. So they're gone. So that's why everything's cleared out so quickly. And that's what she's seeing there. And remember also, too, that rumor that Rick had heard about, that the Vietnamese got so much money for a tattooed ear of one of these army dogs. That could possibly be a reason why the people are trying to capture her. She's worth money. And keep in mind, these people that fought for the Viet Cong, they could have multiple reasons for doing so. It could be because they're being forced to do it, being paid to do it, or because they agree with the Viet Cong. There's a lot of things going into play there. She ran off past the rice paddy and didn't stop until she'd reached a jungle. Then she lay down behind a canopy of leaves and didn't move. She just thought. She knew she was in the right place because she'd smelled Rick's bed, and because she just knew. Except for when her head pounded, she always knew exactly where she was in relation to where she'd been. She didn't know how she knew. She could still hear in the distance the sounds of people ripping up the camp. Something exploded and someone screamed. Nothing unusual. Cracker's mouth had grown parched. That's a fancy word for dry, guys. But she ignored it. Her stomach grumbled, but it didn't matter. She lowered her head to the ground and thought about all the different places she had been with Rick and whether he might have gone to one of those places. The only other place they'd stayed a long time was Tonsinu, when they'd first arrived. They'd been there another time for a visit to a man who'd poked her for some reason. Rick called him Vet. She saw vets all the time since being in this place. But there was also Benoit and the man who'd scratched her ears so well. Should she go there? That would have been the Special Forces guy, where he was with Camel and them. She hardly moved until night, and then she crawled all the way to the camp just the way Rick had taught her to move when there was danger. The camp was now truly empty. She lay where Rick's bed had been, which was now an open field, with a few bits of paper flying in the wind like moths. She didn't feel like moving, even when she saw bugs the size of mice scurrying across the field. Ugh. She ached for Rick. He was the source of everything. When morning came and she heard people approaching, she ran back into the forest, again, as thirsty and hungry as she was. She didn't search for food or water. And again, when night fell, she returned to the camp and longed for Rick. But her longing was different from the previous days. Hope was draining from her. She remembered that Willie had never come for her, and now she wondered whether Rick would ever come for her. She didn't understand why people left her. What had she done? Her tongue was getting so dry, it was starting to stick to her mouth. The next morning, when daytime came and just a few people arrived to search through the rubble, she ran again to hide in the jungle. But when night came, she felt too weak to walk to the camp. Her tongue was changing. It was bigger and harder. It didn't curl right anymore. But she didn't feel like searching for water. She just felt like lying there, the way those dogs in the pound had just lain there. At the time, she had wondered why they had lain there that way, but now she understood. She didn't care if she died. She didn't want to be killed by any of those people, though. Instead, she would just lie here and die of thirst. She laid her head on her front paws, and her body shook a bit, as it did when she whimpered. But no whimpers came from her. When morning arrived, she was still alive, but her tongue had changed even more. It hung out of her mouth, bloated and unbendable and dry, like a dead thing that was attached to her. She didn't move, for there was nowhere to go and nothing to do. There was danger everywhere, but even if she could avoid all dangers, what would be the point? Willie had let her go, and Rick had abandoned her. She could feel that she was closer to death today than yesterday. Her tongue was useless, and her throat felt like the time she swallowed a rock and Willie's father had to take her someplace to get it out. And she was having trouble getting air into her. Every time she inhaled, she felt as if she couldn't take in quite enough air. The trees seemed to wobble, but not really the way they wobbled when the wind hit them. She saw sparkles in the air. As she lay dying, she saw a man with a box click it at her. She didn't know what that meant, and she didn't care. Then rain began to drizzle from the sky. She could see it filling a hole in the dirt near her. Despite everything, the rain in the hole beckoned her. She watched the drops splash occasionally into the hole. Occasionally, a drop fell on her tongue. She pushed herself to her feet and almost fell over. She waited a moment, but she couldn't resist the chance to live longer. For what, she didn't know. But she went to the hole and dropped her tongue inside. She felt her tongue soften as it sopped up water. She waited for the hole to fill up again as she hung her tongue in it. A soft foam filled her mouth. Her tongue began to soften, but the drizzle ceased and her mouth began to dry again. Later that day, she heard a noise and saw a boy standing near the edge of the jungle. Her vision still wobbled. For a moment, she wasn't even sure she really saw him. He was staring at her and saying something, but not in an excited tone that those other people had used with her. He was holding a bucket. She growled softly, but didn't move as he set the bucket halfway between them and then stepped back. Then she vaguely remembered seeing him around the camp. He was one of those people who went through the garbage. Not one of Rick's friends, but she remembered that Rick had thrown him some cans of food once. He was dark, small, and slender. He had only one leg, and he walked with a stick. She wondered if he had come to kill her. "Name Quan," he said. "Name Quan." He patted his chest. "Quan." He pointed to the bucket. She knew what name was, sort of. "You hunt? You help Quan?" She didn't know what he was babbling about, but she could smell food in the bucket. Cracker knew danger, and she knew opportunity, and she knew that sometimes they could exist in the same place. Despite everything, that food in the bucket beckoned her. She walked over. The food tasted new, different, but she dipped her entire nose and mouth in it, causing a sensation almost like pain and pleasure at the same time. Then she swallowed over and over until the bucket was empty. She could almost feel the food spreading throughout her whole body. When she was finished, the boy was waiting patiently. He said again, "You help Quan?" She shook herself out. Her whole body felt stiff, the way it had after the first long ride to this strange land. She started to peek out of the jungle, but the boy said something excitedly. She looked at him curiously. He put his cigarette butt in his mouth and lit it with a lighter just like Rick used to do. Cracker waited. She didn't expect anything at all. She just waited. She felt her body strengthening. She didn't trust the boy, but on the other hand, he had just helped her. So she waited. Then she heard someone behind him shouting, and she knew it was about her. She ran off, alone again.